The rise of the empire is often remembered as a sudden betrayal or a shocking reversal, but the truth embedded in the story is far quieter and far more disturbing. Power was not seized, it was handed over carefully, repeatedly, and with relief. Fear did not appear organically, it was cultivated through endless emergencies that made extraordinary measures feel ordinary. Crisis became the atmosphere rather than the exception. In that environment, authoritarian control stopped sounding extreme and started sounding responsible. What matters most is that fear was manufactured long before it was ever exploited. Each new threat justified the expansion of authority, and each expansion reframed the previous one as insufficient. Stability was always just one more concession away. The public was trained to expect danger and to reward decisiveness over deliberation. When people live in constant crisis, they stop asking who benefits from it. Control becomes synonymous with competence. The Republic therefore did not collapse under attack, but transitioned through consent. Emergency powers were framed as temporary solutions, but no one wanted the burden of reclaiming responsibility afterward. Returning authority felt risky when centralized control felt efficient. Leaders discovered that surrendering power was easier than exercising it. What began as delegation hardened into dependency. Democracy eroded not through rebellion but through exhaustion. Galactic Republic demonstrates how systems fail when accountability becomes optional. The Senate remains active, the procedures remain intact, and the language remains democratic. What disappears is the willingness to say no. Every delay is justified by fear of making things worse. By the time permanence sets in, it feels like maintenance rather than change. The Republic survives in name while abandoning function. As this transition unfolds, the Jedi Order quietly loses public trust long before it is branded as treasonous. Once seen as guardians, they become visible symbols of the war machine. Their role as generals blurs the line between protection and enforcement. Mysticism paired with military authority breeds suspicion rather than reassurance. When fear dominates perception, nuance collapses. The Jedi become easy to recast as threats. Jedi Order suffers not only from internal rigidity, but from external misalignment. Their visibility in battle undermines their moral authority. They are no longer perceived as impartial keepers of peace, but as instruments of state violence. This shift does not require propaganda alone, it requires repetition. Each campaign reinforces the image. By the time accusations surface, they feel plausible rather than absurd. Palpatine's genius lies in the fact that he never needs to violate the law to achieve absolute power. Every step is procedurally justified, publicly ratified, and carefully documented. He understands that legitimacy is more powerful than fear because it disarms opposition before it forms. By the time anyone recognizes the danger, the process has already validated it. Resistance begins to sound like obstruction. Palpatine operates entirely within the system, while hollowing it out from the inside. He exploits loopholes rather than breaks rules, and he lets others argue for his authority. Each extension of power is requested, not imposed. Applause replaces scrutiny. He never forces compliance, he invites it. The law becomes a weapon because everyone agrees it should be trusted. Order is consistently sold as safety because chaos has already exhausted the population. Endless war normalizes sacrifice and blurs moral boundaries. People stop demanding justice and start demanding quiet. Tyranny does not arrive promising domination, it arrives promising rest. Control feels merciful when fear has become routine. In that climate, freedom begins to feel irresponsible. This framing reveals why opposition never coheres early enough to matter. Those who sense danger hesitate because everything still appears legal. Those who benefit from stability fear disruption more than injustice. Those with authority wait for consensus that will never come. Everyone assumes there will be a clearer moment to act later. That moment never arrives. The transition is complete before anyone names it, because naming it would require acknowledging complicity. Power changes hands without visible violence because violence has already been normalized elsewhere. By the time the crown is placed, it feels ceremonial rather than radical. The empire is not born in secrecy, but in celebration. Fear has already won the argument. The galaxy does not fall asleep, it grows tired. Institutions do not shatter, they yield. And by the time anyone understands what has been lost, responsibility feels heavier than obedience. That understanding sets the stage for why no one stops it while it is still preventable. What ultimately prevents anyone from stopping the transition into empire is not ignorance, but diffusion of responsibility spread so thin that action feels presumptuous. Good people recognize warning signs yet assume intervention belongs to someone else with greater authority. Senators wait for the Jedi wait for the council, citizens wait for leadership. Each delay feels reasonable because the system still appears functional. Evil advances not through unanimity, but through hesitation. This hesitation is reinforced by the Clone Wars, which normalize control long before it becomes permanent. Emergency measures stop feeling temporary once they define daily life. Surveillance becomes synonymous with protection, and militarization becomes synonymous with order. Obedience is reframed as civic duty rather than submission. When control is everywhere, it becomes invisible. The war teaches people how to live under restriction without noticing the cost. Grand Army of the Republic embodies this normalization because its existence reshapes expectations of governance. A standing army becomes routine. Command hierarchies replace debate. Decisions are justified by speed rather than legitimacy. The Republic becomes accustomed to solving political problems with military solutions. Once that shift occurs, civilian authority is already compromised. Moral compromise always precedes structural collapse because it trains people to accept discomfort incrementally. Small concessions are made to avoid larger confrontations. Principles are bent to preserve unity. Each exception is justified as necessary under extraordinary circumstances. Over time, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. When domination finally arrives, it feels like continuity rather than rupture. This gradual erosion explains why resistance never coalesces early enough to matter. Those who object sound alarmist because the change is slow. Those who benefit feel protected because the system still works for them. Those who suffer are isolated because suffering is distributed unevenly. By the time injustice is undeniable, it is also entrenched. The window for prevention closes quietly. The Jedi misread this moment because they focus on winning the war rather than preserving the system that legitimizes their role. They believe defeating external enemies will restore balance. In reality, the war is the mechanism through which balance is destroyed. By becoming generals, they accept the logic of militarization. They protect the Republic's borders while its core dissolves. Victory becomes irrelevant. Jedi High Council prioritizes tactical success over institutional integrity. They sense the dark side, but interpret it as a battlefield problem rather than a civic one. The Sith are hunted while authoritarianism is ignored. The Jedi fight symptoms instead of causes. By the time they recognize the true threat, they are already positioned as enemies of the state. This miscalculation is fatal because authoritarian systems collapse opposition by redefining it as instability. Once fear dominates public perception, resistance feels dangerous rather than courageous. Speaking out becomes synonymous with prolonging chaos. Silence becomes virtuous. The Jedi are isolated not because they are wrong, but because the narrative has already shifted. Order has been framed as the highest good. Palpatine's final move succeeds because by that point, it feels like resolution rather than betrayal. The war has exhausted everyone. Responsibility feels heavy, and delegation feels merciful. The Empire is offered as closure to an era of uncertainty. People applaud because they believe the crisis is over. They do not yet understand that crisis has simply changed shape. Galactic Empire emerges into a galaxy already conditioned to accept it. Its authority feels earned because fear has been constant. Its rigidity feels reassuring because choice has been overwhelming. Its cruelty is rationalized because peace has been promised. By the time dissent forms, it sounds nostalgic rather than urgent. The system has already rewritten the past. This inevitability is not fate, but momentum built from accumulated avoidance. Each person who waits for permission strengthens the structure they fear. Each compromise becomes precedent. Each silence becomes consent. The Empire does not require universal support, only enough exhaustion to neutralize resistance. Once fear wins the argument, alternatives feel irresponsible. The crown is placed on a throne no one remembers building. Star Wars uses this progression to dismantle the myth that tyranny requires villains alone. It requires participation, disengagement, and fatigue. The most dangerous moment is not when power is seized, but when it is surrendered willingly. The saga insists that vigilance is an active responsibility, not a passive state. Freedom demands maintenance. When that maintenance feels inconvenient, collapse accelerates. This reading also explains why rebellion later feels both necessary and tragic. The cost of resistance is high precisely because it arrives too late. Violence becomes the only language left because dialogue was abandoned earlier. The rebellion fights the symptom, not the origin. Their heroism exists because prevention failed. Every blaster fired is a reminder of opportunities missed. The tragedy is that many characters sense this truth, but lack the collective courage to act on it simultaneously. Awareness without coordination becomes paralysis. Institutions fail when everyone knows something is wrong, but no one believes action will be supported. Authoritarianism exploits this loneliness. It thrives where dissent feels isolating. The Empire is built from that isolation. In the end, Star Wars presents authoritarianism not as an aberration, but as a process fueled by fear, legality, and delay. The Republic's transformation is not dramatic because real collapse rarely is. It is procedural, polite, and incremental. The lesson is not that villains are powerful, but that systems are fragile when vigilance fades. No one stops it because stopping it would require acting before certainty, and certainty never arrives. This conclusion reframes the saga's political arc as a warning rather than a fantasy. Power is rarely stolen outright. It is offered. Fear prepares the ground, procedure does the work, and by the time people realize what has happened, responsibility feels heavier than obedience. That is why the Empire rises without resistance, and why dismantling it later requires so much sacrifice.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.